At 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, a message left Washington that may have just changed the trajectory of the Middle East war and possibly the global economy. But if you're watching mainstream television right now, you probably wouldn't realize how serious this moment actually is. Because behind the calm headlines and cautious language, something far more explosive is unfolding. Early today, President Donald Trump issued a declaration that stunned diplomats, military strategists, and financial markets alike. The war with Iran will end only with unconditional surrender. Not negotiations, not a ceasefire, not another fragile deal that buys time. Unconditional surrender. Within hours of that statement, massive waves of airstrikes reportedly expanded across Iranian territory, while retaliatory missiles and drones surged across the skies of the Middle East. Air defenses are firing, cities are shaking, and the conflict is now drifting dangerously close to one of the most critical pressure points in the entire global economy. The Strait of Hormuz. Nearly 20% of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow corridor every single day. If that artery closes even briefly, the consequences could ripple through every major economy on the planet. Energy markets are already beginning to panic. Oil traders are whispering numbers that sound almost unreal. $120, $140, even $150 a barrel. If you want to understand what is really unfolding before the mainstream narrative catches up, make sure you subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because what happens next could reshape the balance of power in the Middle East faster than anyone expected. So here's the question everyone should be asking right now. What exactly is happening behind the headlines, and where is this war heading next? Because if you look carefully at the sequence of events over the last several days, a very clear pattern begins to emerge, and it suggests that this conflict may be entering a far more dangerous phase than most governments are willing to publicly admit. In this analysis, I'm going to guide you through three critical developments that are shaping the trajectory of this war. First, we'll examine the real meaning behind the demand for unconditional surrender and why that phrase signals something far bigger than a normal military objective. Second, I will break down the chain reaction already spreading across the Middle East, including the expanding missile exchanges, the growing pressure on Gulf states, and the dangerous strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz. And third, I'll outline several possible scenarios that could unfold in the coming days, ranging from a sudden political collapse inside Iran to a full-scale regional escalation that could shock global markets. Because right now the clock is moving and every hour may be changing the balance of power. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, we need to move beyond the headlines and examine the three structural pressures that are now pushing this conflict toward a much larger geopolitical confrontation. Because what we are seeing is not just a battlefield escalation, it is a systematic breakdown of deterrence across the Middle East. And once deterrence collapses, conflicts tend to spread faster than anyone anticipates. Let's start with the first pressure point. Condition 1. The meaning of unconditional surrender. When a world leader publicly demands unconditional surrender, that phrase carries a very specific historical weight. It is not diplomatic language, it is war language. The last time the United States used that exact term at the strategic level was during World War II, when President Franklin Roosevelt declared that Axis powers would be required to surrender completely. That concept meant something very clear. The opposing government would lose its ability to negotiate the outcome of the war. So when that same phrase appears again in modern geopolitics, analysts immediately begin asking a different question. Not how the war ends, but what political structure replaces the current regime if surrender occurs. Several former national security officials have already hinted that this conflict may be aimed at something broader than simply neutralizing missiles or naval threats. A retired U.S. general speaking at a strategic forum earlier this year put it bluntly: if a government is asked to surrender unconditionally, that usually means the war aims extend beyond the battlefield and into the political structure of the state itself. In other words, the objective may not simply be military damage. It may involve forcing a fundamental transformation of power inside Iran, and that leads directly to the second pressure point. Condition 2. The expanding military theater conflicts rarely stay contained once multiple regional actors become involved, and that is exactly what we are seeing now. The war is no longer limited to two sides exchanging strikes. Instead, it is beginning to ripple outward across the entire Middle East security architecture. Missile defense systems across the region have already been activated at levels rarely seen outside full-scale war. Airspace restrictions have expanded, commercial flights are being rerouted, and several Gulf states are quietly reinforcing their own defensive positions in case the conflict spills across their borders. Military analysts often describe this phase as the regionalization of a conflict. Once that stage begins, the battlefield stops being defined by geography. It becomes defined by alliances. Israel is coordinating closely with Western partners. Iran is relying on networks of regional allies and affiliated groups. And every missile launched raises the risk that another country could become directly involved. A former NATO strategist once summarized this dynamic with a simple warning: regional wars rarely stay regional once airspace, shipping lanes, and missile defenses overlap. Which brings us to the most economically dangerous pressure point of all. Condition 3, the Strait of Hormuz. If there is one geographic location capable of turning a regional war into a global economic crisis, it is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway sits between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. At its narrowest point, it is only about 21 miles wide. But despite that small size, it carries an enormous strategic burden. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through this corridor every day. That means energy tankers traveling from major Gulf producers must navigate through a channel that is both narrow and politically volatile. If that route becomes unsafe, even temporarily, the shockwaves spread instantly across global markets. Energy traders monitor Hormuz almost like a financial heartbeat. Any disruption can send oil prices climbing within hours. And that price movement doesn't stay inside the energy sector. It cascades through the entire global economy. Transportation costs increase, manufacturing costs rise, food prices begin to climb. A well-known investor once summarized the vulnerability of this choke point with a stark observation: the Strait of Hormuz is one of the few places on Earth where a regional conflict can trigger a global recession in days. That is why military planners treat this corridor as one of the most sensitive strategic zones in the world. Even the perception of danger there can change economic behavior. Insurance costs for oil tankers rise, shipping routes adjust, energy futures markets become volatile, and investors begin preparing for inflation shocks. So when a war begins drifting toward that choke point, analysts immediately understand the implications. This is no longer just a military story. It becomes a global economic risk scenario. Now, if you're beginning to see how these three pressures connect, the political demand for surrender, the expanding regional battlefield, and the economic vulnerability of Hormuz, hit the like button right now, because understanding these connections is the key to understanding why this conflict is suddenly making governments, markets, and military planners extremely nervous. And the most important question is still ahead. What happens when the deadline pressure of war meets the political refusal to surrender? Because when that moment arrives, the conflict could move in several very different directions. So what happens next? Because once wars reach this stage where political ultimatums, expanding battlefields, and economic choke points all collide, the conflict usually begins moving toward a decisive turning point. Right now, analysts are quietly discussing three possible scenarios that could unfold if the pressure continues to escalate. And each one carries dramatically different consequences for the Middle East and the global economy. Scenario 1, full capitulation. In the first scenario, Iran ultimately chooses to avoid a prolonged war and agrees to a form of comprehensive surrender or sweeping concessions. That outcome would likely involve dismantling key missile capabilities, abandoning certain military programs, and accepting international oversight over major strategic systems. From a military perspective, this would represent a dramatic shift in the regional balance of power. Israel and its Western partners would emerge with significantly strengthened deterrence. Global markets would likely respond with relief. Oil prices would stabilize. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz would resume normal flow. But politically, this scenario would create a completely different kind of instability. A sudden capitulation could trigger internal fractures within Iran's leadership, creating power struggles between political factions, military institutions, and ideological hardliners. History shows that rapid political collapse rarely produces immediate stability. Instead, it often opens the door to years of internal uncertainty. Scenario 2, partial compliance. The second scenario is far more complicated. Iran could attempt a limited compromise, offering certain concessions while refusing total surrender. This might include reducing specific military capabilities or agreeing to partial inspections while preserving core elements of national defense. From a diplomatic perspective, this type of outcome would allow both sides to claim victory. Military operations could gradually slow, regional tensions might cool, but this scenario carries its own risks. A partial settlement often leaves strategic ambiguity, meaning both sides remain suspicious of the other's long-term intentions. Deterrence becomes fragile. One miscalculation, one missile strike, one drone incident, one maritime confrontation could reignite the entire conflict. In other words, the war might pause, but the underlying confrontation would remain unresolved. Scenario 3. Total escalation. The third scenario is the one that worries military planners the most. If Iran refuses surrender and military operations continue intensifying, the conflict could expand beyond its current boundaries. Additional regional actors could become involved. Missile exchanges could widen across the Gulf, and the Strait of Hormuz could become a central pressure point in the conflict. If tanker routes are disrupted, the global energy system would feel the shock immediately. Oil prices could surge dramatically. Financial markets would react. Inflation pressures would rise across major economies, and governments around the world would suddenly find themselves managing both a geopolitical crisis and an economic shock at the same time. This is the scenario where a regional war stops being regional and begins affecting the entire global system. The question now is simple. Which path will the conflict take? Compromise, capitulation, or escalation? Because the clock is still ticking. And every new strike, every new political statement, and every new military deployment pushes events closer to one of these outcomes. So where does this leave us tonight? A war that began as a series of military strikes is now evolving into something much bigger. A test of power, resolve, and the future balance of the Middle East. The demand for unconditional surrender has changed the stakes completely. It has transformed this conflict from a limited military campaign into a confrontation where one side must eventually give ground, and that means the clock is now ticking. Every new missile launch, every airstrike, every political statement pushes the region closer to a moment where the next decision could reshape the geopolitical order for years to come. Because once wars reach this level of pressure, they rarely end quietly. They end with a decisive shift in power. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Iran will ultimately stand its ground and resist even if the war escalates further? Or do you believe the pressure will eventually force a major political compromise or surrender? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read every perspective, and if you want to stay ahead of the next major development in this rapidly changing situation, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because this story is far from over.